In the aftermath of fire and fallout, the real reckoning begins. Israel's 2025 strike on Iran's nuclear program didn't just ignite retaliation. It fractured the system of norms, treaties, and assumptions that once governing restraint. In this final episode, we follow what broke: the credibility of inspections, the authority of the IAEA, the boundaries of the NPT, and we trace how prophecy, identity, and grievance, long simmering beneath policy, have begun to dictate it. This moment, when sacred history collided with nuclear reality.
Focusing specifically on the fallout from Operation Rising Lion and the ripple effects stretching beyond 2025. We have a stack of materials here that cover several areas: the impact on Iran's ancient Jewish community, the powerful role of memory and mythology in shaping identity in both Israel and Iran, the strategic shifts and realignments across the broader Middle East, and finally, how these regional dynamics connect to broader global frameworks and, well, challenge international norms.
Our mission is to extract the most important insights from this material, giving you a clear, detailed understanding of what happened, why it matters, and the complex new realities emerging from this period that some are calling after the fire. We'll go through your sources piece by piece, highlighting the key developments and connections.
What do these sources tell us about the immediate and lasting consequences, starting with the impact inside Iran?
Right, so our first set of sources takes us inside Iran, specifically looking at the profound impact of Operation Rising Lion on Iran's ancient Jewish minority. This community, with roots spanning millennia, found itself navigating an incredibly precarious situation, really caught in the crossfire of a direct conflict happening right on their home soil.
Operation Rising Lion, as the source describes, refers to the large-scale Israeli strikes targeting Iran's nuclear and military sites launched on June 13, 2025. Iran then retaliated, firing missiles and drones at Israel, and vowed severe punishment for the Zionist regime.
Right, and caught in the middle was Iran's Jewish community. The source notes that this community, which was once over 80,000 strong before the 1979 revolution, had already dwindled to under 10,000 by 2025. They are primarily centered in cities like Tehran, Shiraz, and Isfahan. Suddenly, this small, ancient community faced the direct social and legal fallout of a major Iran-Israel conflict happening within Iran. This immediately raised concerns for their safety and status.
That must have been terrifying. What do the sources say about their legal status and any anti-Jewish policies or, pressures they faced after the conflict?
Well, the sources clarify that Iran's regime does not explicitly outlaw Judaism itself. In fact, Jews are recognized as a religious minority with a guaranteed seat in parliament and nominal constitutional protections. Unlike, for instance, the Baha'i community in Iran, who face systemic persecution and lack legal recognition, Iranian Jews generally have formal legal standing to practice their faith and maintain communal institutions like synagogues.
But I understand those constitutional protections don't amount to full equality. There are significant limitations, correct?
Systemic discrimination under Sharia law is deeply entrenched. Non-Muslims face significant limits in legal testimony. Their word may not carry the same weight in court as a Muslim's. They are also barred from holding certain government posts, particularly those deemed sensitive. These and other civic inequalities mean Iranian Jews remain second-class citizens in many respects, despite the nominal protections. Crucially, since the 1980s, the regime has drawn a hard line between good Jews, who are seen as loyal Iranian citizens, and Zionists, who are cast as enemies of the state. This distinction effectively requires Jewish Iranians to constantly prove their loyalty by explicitly distancing themselves, both publicly and privately, from Israel and the concept of Zionism. The sources state this pressure to denounce Israel only intensified post-2025, making their position even more precarious as the conflict flared.
Did the conflict trigger the enactment of new official anti-Jewish laws, or was it more about increased enforcement of existing pressures?
The sources indicate no new anti-Jewish laws were officially announced or codified immediately after the strikes. However, scrutiny of Jews under security pretexts has risen significantly. Iranian intelligence has historically viewed any contact with Israel, even innocent family ties or communication with diaspora Jews, perceived as having connections as potential espionage, a suspicion that applies acutely and dangerously to Jewish citizens. The sources remind us of past cases that highlight this peril, such as the Shiraz trial of 13 Jews in 1999, where espionage charges were used to target prominent members of the Jewish community. This serves as a chilling precedent, showing how easily accusations of disloyalty can morph into serious criminal charges a sword of Damocles hanging over the community, according to one source.
So the threat is more about the existing legal framework being weaponized and increased surveillance rather than entirely new legislation.
Precisely. In the wake of the 2025 conflict, the regime's security organs quietly tightened surveillance on individuals deemed at risk of Zionist sympathy, while publicly insisting its Jewish minority is safe. This means the risk is often implicit. The threat of prosecution on security grounds encourages Iranian Jews to be extremely cautious in word and deed, to self-police and avoid drawing unwanted attention from the state apparatus. It's a key takeaway from the sources. The absence of new laws doesn't mean an absence of heightened pressure and risk. Repeat this for retention. The lack of new laws doesn't mean lack of pressure.
With a history spanning, 2,500 years in Iran, how are they managing to preserve their cultural life amidst these political and legal pressures?
Well, Iran's Jewish heritage is incredibly deep, and the community has maintained a complete Jewish life within the Islamic Republic, according to the sources. As of 2025, despite the difficult conditions, there were dozens of active synagogues, about 30 in Tehran alone, along with kosher butchers and restaurants, Jewish schools offering Hebrew and religious education, and even a matzah bakery. This resilience and commitment to cultural continuity is really remarkable.
That's quite a vibrant picture. Considering the context, did the strikes lead to the closure of these institutions?
The post-2025 period, the sources state, did not see outright state-ordered bans or closures of synagogues or Jewish schools. And this is a significant point about the regime's balancing act. However, the sources highlight a deep underlying fear of cultural erasure by attrition. This refers to the community slowly shrinking due to emigration and an aging population. As numbers fall and resources dwindle, maintaining these institutions, traditions, and services grows harder each year. The Tehran Jewish Committee's 2025 report, cited in the source, candidly described mounting financial difficulties. High inflation, exacerbated by international sanctions and the economic strain of the conflict, has strained community budgets significantly. This threatens key services like kindergartens, a senior center, and cultural hubs vital for maintaining community cohesion and identity.
So it's an economic and demographic challenge as much as, perhaps even more than, a direct state threat.
It's a multifaceted struggle. Keeping Jewish institutions open and traditions alive has required delicate negotiation with authorities, constant affirmations of loyalty to the regime, and overcoming immense economic hurdles. The survival strategies employed by Iran's Jews, which often involve public displays of patriotism and denouncements of Israel, are described as a defining feature of this era, a necessary performance, you might say, for cultural continuity under duress. Community leaders repeatedly emphasize that Judaism is purely a religion, distinct from Zionism, and they ritually denounce Israel to avoid regime ire and maintain their autonomy. For instance, the Tehran Jewish Committee's report, released just days before the Israeli strikes, pledged loyalty to Ayatollah Khamenei and praised the Islamic Republic for providing complete security while renouncing any ties to the Zionist regime.
This sounds like a very calculated performance for survival, almost like learning a specific language they must use to navigate a dangerous political landscape.
The sources confirm this. Such statements of fealty are widely understood within and outside the community as protective, performative measures described as a language you have to speak to maintain autonomy in Iran. Since Operation Rising Lion, these performances have only become more pronounced and visible, as the community feels increased pressure to demonstrate loyalty and distance themselves from the adversary. Iranian Jews have joined state-organized Quds Day rallies condemning Israel, signed statements mourning Palestinian casualties, and even, in one instance mentioned, called for revenge against Israeli terrorism, publicly aligning with regime propaganda to protect themselves from suspicion.
That's a difficult and compromising position, isn't it? Requiring a constant balancing act between maintaining their identity and ensuring their safety.
It is. While these acts might outwardly suggest genuine anti-Israel sentiment, historians and exiles note they are born of necessity, a survival mechanism to prevent cultural erasure and ensure Jewish institutions can continue operating under an Islamist regime that is fundamentally hostile to Israel. It's a pragmatic response to a dangerous reality.
What about immigration? Was there a large exodus of Iranian Jews after the strikes?
Immigration has been a key safety valve over past decades, significantly contributing to the population decline. But by 2025, those who remained were often the most rooted, older, or economically entrenched, and thus more reluctant to leave despite the challenges. After Operation Rising Lion, there was considerable international concern about a potential refugee outflow. Jewish diaspora organizations took notice. The Jewish Agency set up a special situation room in Jerusalem the day the conflict began, monitoring at-risk Jewish populations, including Iran's, for potential evacuation needs.
That shows the level of international concern for their safety.
It does. However, the sources state that through late 2025, there was no sudden, large-scale refugee outflow. Community sources within Iran indicated no plans for mass aliyah. Immigration to Israel materialized immediately. This aligns with pre-conflict observations that most remaining Iranian Jews had no plans to leave anytime soon, citing deep emotional attachment to Iran and skepticism about starting over abroad. Many are older or economically entrenched, making a move difficult. They even perceive security risks in Israel given regional instability, suggesting even Israel doesn't feel like a completely safe haven to some. So numbers remained roughly steady, although anecdotal reports suggest a handful of families with means did quietly expedite emigration via Turkey or Europe. The long-term trend of slow population shrinkage continues as younger generations depart and elders pass away. International Jewish charities and Israel's government are ready to facilitate emigration if persecution rises. But as of 2025-2026, the strategy is to persevere in place rather than become refugees. Contingency planning exists, though, and observers warn that any severe crackdown could quickly trigger a small-scale exodus, even if a wholesale refugee wave hasn't occurred. A mnemonic might be steady ship, leaky seams, macros. The overall numbers are steady, but the gradual emigration continues like slow leaks.
You mentioned cultural institutions weren't officially closed. Did the conflict directly cause any permanent closures of synagogues or schools, or was it more indirect pressure?
No, the sources report no official state orders to shut down Jewish institutions since Operation Rising Lion. Synagogues in major cities, continued services, and Jewish schools remained open, which really shows their resilience.
Right.
However, de facto closures and contractions occurred indirectly. During the unrest of 2022-2023, and likely again amid the 2025 tensions, community leaders advised members to avoid gathering in synagogues temporarily for safety. Such warnings essentially shut down communal life for weeks at a time. Also, in smaller provincial towns, many community outposts had already closed permanently over the past decades, effectively disappearing outside the main cities due to demographic decline. The remaining institutions face growing challenges like funding shortfalls, threatening kosher kitchens and Hebrew classes. The Tehran Jewish Committee reported spending tens of billions of reals just to subsidize basic services and prevent closures, described as a Herculean task, exacerbated by inflation and sanctions. Despite this, community leaders emphasized collective effort to ensure institutions remain protected. So while Operation Rising Lion didn't directly destroy institutions, it added significant stress to an already vulnerable network. Their continued operation is increasingly precarious, depending on regime tolerance and dwindling resources.
What about public backlash and safety concerns? Was there actual violence or harassment against Iranian Jews after the strikes?
Indeed. In the immediate aftermath, no mob violence targeting Jews was reported in state or independent media. The regime's tight control likely prevented spontaneous pogroms, as authorities generally don't want chaos that could tarnish their claims of protecting minorities. However, there were disturbing signs of rising hostility and discourse. In government-sanctioned rallies, slogans like "Death to Israel," and from a minority of hardliners, even "Death to Jews" appeared, although official slogans usually target Israel or Zionists specifically. Iranian Jews felt the backlash in more subtle ways. Some reported increased social ostracism and suspicion from Muslim neighbors when tensions with Israel flare. A climate of fear spread within the community that any individual Jew could be scapegoated as a spy if tempers ran hot.
And that fear wasn't baseless.
No, it isn't unfounded. The sources mentioned that during the 2022 anti-regime protests, at least 3 Iranian Jews were arrested simply for being present or tangentially involved. One remained in custody for weeks, underscoring how easily Jews can become targets in times of regime paranoia. Following Rising Lion, Jewish families took a very low profile, avoiding synagogue or scaling back events to avoid attention. Defamation in state-run media also created an atmosphere of menace. While top officials avoided blaming Iran's Jews directly, hardline outlets and social media were rife with conspiracy theories about Zionist spies inside Iran. The Anti-Defamation League reported that extremists worldwide unleashed predictable hate-filled rhetoric online, often blurring the line between Israeli and Jew, fueling anti-Semitic tropes. The Jewish minority faced a public relations predicament, having to prove their patriotic loyalty louder than ever to stave off popular resentment. This strategy has averted direct violence so far, but the community remained on high alert.
It sounds like every act of discretion, like a shuttered synagogue door or removing Hebrew signage, is a testament to that ambient intimidation.
Jewish representatives, a broad voice concerned that Iranian Jews are effectively hostages to Iranian-Israeli enmity, vulnerable despite having no role in Israeli actions. Their safety is tied to a conflict they are not part of.
Finally, how did regime rhetoric and official statements frame the situation regarding Jews after the conflict? Did they differentiate?
Regime rhetoric reached a fever pitch against Israel, sending somewhat mixed signals about Jews. Supreme Leader Khamenei blasted the strikes as satanic and warned of a grave mistake, ushering in a bitter and painful future for Israel. Importantly, Iranian leaders largely stuck to their usual formulation, condemning Zionists and the Israeli regime rather than explicitly targeting Jews. Officially, they maintain a differentiation between Judaism, protected religion, and Zionism, hostile political ideology.
Right, that distinction again.
Yes. Immediately after the 2025 strikes, Iran's lone Jewish member of parliament, Homayun Sameana Jafabadi, was presented to reinforce this message. He applauded Iran's military response and declared, "The Jewish community of Iran fully supports the honorable IRGC operation against the Zionist regime." By showcasing a Jewish representative condemning Israel, the regime aimed to show that even Iranian Jews stand with Tehran. State media highlighted letters from the community praising Khamenei and mourning martyrs to craft an image of national unity.
But you mentioned an undertone, a sort of doublespeak.
Yes. Beneath these orchestrated statements lies a strident undertone of anti-Semitic conspiracy in wider regime rhetoric and media. Iranian propaganda frequently asserts that Israel and its supporters, often insinuating Jews globally, are behind Iran's troubles. Before the conflict, they promoted tropes of a global Zionist cabal. After Rising Lion, these narratives intensified. The IRGC intelligence arm claimed to uncover Israeli spy networks orchestrating domestic dissent, and hardliners branded regime opponents as tools of the Jewish American plot. At Friday prayers and on state TV, commentators railed that the world's most dangerous regime must be eliminated, sometimes slipping into blatant anti-Semitism despite attempts to use the word Zionist. So the regime's public stance post-2025 is two-faced, outwardly professing protection for loyal Jewish citizens while inwardly amplifying anti-Israel and implicitly anti-Jewish invective. This tightrope is exemplified by the community's own publications, which open with effusive praise of Khomeini and Khamenei and assertions that the Jews of Iran live in complete security under the leadership of the Islamic Republic. In the same breath, these statements completely separate Iranian Jews from the Zionist regime, using language virtually dictated by the state.
A very precarious balancing act.
Extremely. The government's rhetoric signals that as long as Iran's Jews remain politically quiescent and vocally anti-Zionist, they will be tolerated. But any perceived deviation could make them targets of the regime's wrathful rhetoric. Micro Recap 1. So to quickly recap this first part, we've seen how Operation Rising Lion, while not directly targeting Iran's Jews, has significantly heightened their vulnerability. Their legal status remains second class, regime scrutiny and the threat of espionage charges have increased, and while cultural institutions haven't been banned, economic pressure and subtle intimidation threaten their viability. Emigration continues slowly, but no mass exodus occurred immediately, and the regime's rhetoric performs a balancing act, publicly protecting loyal Jews while amplifying anti-Zionist, often anti-Semitic narratives.
The conclusion of this section in the sources summarizes this difficult reality, right?
It reinforces a paradoxical reality for Iran's Jewish minority. They survive and assert Persian patriotism, continuing 2,500-year traditions, but under increasing demographic fragility, relentless pressure to repudiate affinity with Israel, and the looming shadow of suspicion during conflict. Since 2025, Iran's Jews navigated heightened scrutiny, but also cautious state protection. They are pointed to as proof of Iran's tolerance, even as they are implicitly held hostage to the conflict with Israel. Key indicators to watch beyond 2025 include whether emigration accelerates, if economic decay forces communal closures, and if the regime's stance hardens or softens. The trends are troubling, but the community's endurance attests to a resilient cultural identity. They continue walking a fine line, preserving heritage and safety in an Iran that publicly welcomes their faith, but ruthlessly crushes any hint of dual loyalty. The events of 2025 have sharpened the lines around this fine line, leaving the fate of this ancient community delicately poised between survival and exodus, tolerance and terror in the uncertain years ahead. Let's do a comprehensive recap of Section 1, focusing on the impact on Iran's Jewish community. Operation Rising Lion in June 2025 significantly intensified pressure on Iran's Jewish minority. While not outlawed, Iranian Jews face systemic legal discrimination under Sharia and are required to prove loyalty by denouncing Zionism and Israel. Regime scrutiny under security pretexts increased post-2025, fueled by historical use of espionage charges against Jews. Jewish cultural life continues with synagogues, schools, etc., but faces threats from demographic decline, economic strain, and subtle intimidation, leading to fears of cultural erasure by attrition. Survival strategies include delicate negotiations with authorities and performative statements of loyalty and anti-Zionism. Despite international concern, there was no sudden mass emigration after the strikes, though the long-term trend of gradual shrinkage continues. No official institutional closures occurred, but de facto disruptions happened, and provincial communities have largely disappeared. Public backlash was seen in hostile discourse and increased social suspicion, though regime control prevented mob violence. Fear of scapegoating is present. Regime rhetoric publicly differentiates between Judaism and Zionism, showcasing Jewish leaders' denunciations of Israel, while hardline media amplifies anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, creating a two-faced stance. The community's future survival is precarious, balancing between regime tolerance, contingent on vocal anti-Zionism, and the constant threat linked to the conflict with Israel. Here are the key points from this section for retention. Pre-2025 Jewish population below 10K from 80K. Legal status. Recognized minority, second-class citizens under Sharia. Key demand. Public denunciation of Zionism Israel. Cultural survival. Institutions open, but economic demographic threats high. Emigration. Gradual decline. No mass exodus post-2025 yet. Backlash. Discourse hostility. Subtle fear. No reported mob violence post-2025. Regime rhetoric. Official anti-Zionism. Unofficial anti-Semitic undertones. Core reality. Precarious survival. Hostage to Iran-Israel conflict. Type continue for further detail.
Our next source dives deep into the powerful role of history, mythology, and even scripture in shaping national identity and policy in both Israel and Iran. It shows how ancient narratives continue to influence modern conflicts in, well, quite potent and sometimes surprising ways.
Yes, this section provides an extensive examination of how memory, mythology, and identity intersect in these two nations. It focuses specifically on the complex and contrasting legacy of Cyrus the Great and the increasing use of theological and prophetic language in conflict rhetoric by leaders on both sides.
Let's start with Cyrus the Great. The source describes a fascinating Israeli commemorative coin. Can you walk us through what it shows and what it signifies in the context of this discussion?
Yes, the source mentions this Israeli coin. If you were to look at it, it visually depicts three figures. Persia's ancient king Cyrus, standing alongside Lord Balfour, from the 1917 declaration supporting a Jewish homeland, and U.S. President Trump, who moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. Verbally describing this visual, it's a really powerful symbolic artifact. It deliberately links Cyrus's ancient decree allowing the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple with these very modern acts seen as supporting Israel's statehood and its claim to Jerusalem. It draws a direct historical and theological line across 2,500 years.
That's a very strong visual connection across millennia. How is Cyrus seen in Israeli memory and national narrative?
In Jewish tradition and Israeli memory, Cyrus the Great is deeply revered. He's seen as a divinely appointed benefactor, almost a kind of messianic figure actually. The Hebrew Bible, particularly of books like Isaiah and Ezra, praises him highly for ending the Babylonian exile back in 539 BCE and issuing the decree permitting the Jewish exiles to return and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. The book of Isaiah even calls Cyrus God's anointed, a Messiah figure who, though a Gentile king, carried out God's will in restoring Israel to its land and central place of worship.
Wow, anointed.
This legacy is profoundly embedded in Israeli historical consciousness and Zionist thought. Early Zionists saw clear parallels between Cyrus's decree and modern events like the 1917 Balfour Declaration and the 1948 UN vote for Israel's establishment, viewing them as continuations of a prophetic pattern of return to the homeland after exile. Famously, U.S. President Harry Truman, the first world leader to recognize the State of Israel, explicitly embraced this comparison to Cyrus. When introduced to Jewish leaders as the man who helped create Israel, Truman reportedly responded, "What do you mean helped create? I am Cyrus, acknowledging the biblical role he felt he was playing. That shows how deeply this biblical archetype resonated even outside Israel.
And this continues today, as seen with the coin and recent political rhetoric.
Yes. In recent years, Israeli leaders have explicitly invoked Cyrus to frame alliances and national destiny. In 2018, PM Benjamin Netanyahu likened President Trump to Cyrus. He recalled Cyrus's decree 25 centuries ago and then lauded Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, as an act that will be remembered by our people throughout the ages.
So casting Trump as a modern Cyrus.
Precisely. A non-Jewish ruler used by God, in this view, to favor Israel and advance its biblical destiny. The coin we mentioned reinforces this comparison, literally sealing the parallel. The subtext is clear. Modern Israel views friends who advance its biblical promises as heirs to Cyrus's legacy of divine favor. Repeat this for retention. Cyrus equals ancient archetype for righteous Gentile supporters of Israel.
How does Iran view Cyrus the Great? Is it the same kind of reverence?
Not at all. It's much more complicated. In Iran, Cyrus occupies a central but far more contentious place in national memory. As founder of the Achaemenid Empire, he represents pre-Islamic imperial glory, a kind of golden age. In nationalist narratives within Iran, he's credited with enshrining principles of human rights and tolerance through his famous cylinder. Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi heavily promoted Cyrus's legacy to bolster secular Iranian nationalism and his own legitimacy. He staged those extravagant 2,500-year celebrations of monarchy at Cyrus's tomb in Pasargadae in 1971 and lauded the Cyrus cylinder as the first declaration of human rights, recasting the king as a patron of religious freedom. This state-driven cult of Cyrus helped legitimize the Shah's regime as heir to this ancient lineage.
And after the 1979 revolution, how did the new Islamic Republic view this pre-Islamic icon?
Iran's new clerical rulers grew deeply ambivalent, maybe even suspicious. The Islamic Republic emphasizes its Islamic revolutionary identity, often downplaying pre-Islamic figures seen as symbols of the monarchy or, secularism. However, many ordinary Iranians remain deeply proud of their ancient heritage and see Cyrus as a symbol of national identity separate from the current government. Thousands have flocked to Pasargadae to mark Cyrus Day on October 29, chanting nationalist slogans like, "Iran is our country, Cyrus is our father."
Which sounds quite provocative towards the current regime.
This grassroots reverence, which often carries anti-regime undertones, alarmed the establishment. A massive 2016 gathering at his tomb was met with mass arrests and condemnation. A hardline cleric, Ayatollah Hamadani, blasted the celebrants as counter-revolutionaries, angry they used phrases for Cyrus usually reserved for the supreme leader. Authorities have since restricted access to the tomb on that holiday. This highlights a fundamental tension in Iran's identity. Cyrus is admired by much of the populace as a source of pride, but the clerical establishment is wary of a pre-Islamic icon potentially rivaling the Islamic Revolution's ideology. Officials sometimes try to appropriate his image, but it can backfire, showing the regime's unease with a figure cherished by Iranians, often in opposition to the state.
So for Israel, Cyrus is a symbol of divine favor and support for the Jewish people, an archetype for modern allies. For Iran, he's a potent symbol of pre-Islamic national pride, admired by the people, but viewed with suspicion by the current clerical regime.
The source describes Cyrus as serving as a prophetic mirror in both countries' narratives of nationhood. In Israel, he symbolizes Gentile rulers doing God's work for his chosen people, setting a template for modern Zionist thought where figures like Truman or Trump are celebrated as instruments of divine favor. This underpins the narrative of divine favor guiding Israel's destiny. Israeli discourse often recalls ancient Persian friendship with Jews under Cyrus to criticize today's hostility, implying the current Iranian regime is a tragic aberration and a betrayal of this historic bond.
Interesting, the idea of betrayal.
Yes, and in Iran, the notion of betrayal also exists, but differently. Many Iranians feel the Islamist regime has betrayed the inclusive and tolerant legacy they attribute to Cyrus's empire. The Cyrus cylinder's vision of restoring displaced communities is contrasted with the clerical regime's repression. Chants like, "We are Aryans, we don't worship Arabs," reflecting anger at the regime's emphasis on Arab-centric Shia Islam, show how Cyrus becomes a rallying symbol against the theocracy, seen as betraying Iran's true pre-Islamic heritage. So, for both Israel and segments of Iran, Cyrus is a powerful touchstone. A king who set a template for nationhood, invoked either in hope of renewed divine favor or lament of present betrayal. Despite the different ideologies, each sees in Cyrus a reflection of its identity aspirations. Israel is the biblical nation protected by righteous Gentiles, and Iran as an ancient civilization of justice and glory.
The source provides a comparative table of these perspectives. Can you describe that table's key points verbally?
Certainly. The table contrasts the Israeli and Iranian narratives on Cyrus. On the Israeli side, points include biblical liberator, celebrated as the Gentile Messiah, who ended the exile and allowed temple rebuilding, symbol of nationhood, where figures aiding Israel's rebirth are likened to Cyrus, Truman, Trump, and divine favor narrative, where Cyrus represents non-Jewish rulers under God's influence to benefit Israel, underpinning a view that Israel's success attracts divine favor through others, and contrasting ancient Persian kindness with today's regime as a betrayal. On the Iranian side, points include imperial founder, revered as the father of the nation who established the Achaemenid Empire and is mythologized as a just ruler, noted for the Cyrus cylinder as a charter of rights, Pahlavi-era icon, where the Shah exalted Cyrus to foster nationalism, celebrating 2,500 years of monarchy tied to his legacy, a veneration that still resonates with secular Iranians in the diaspora. And Islamic Republic's ambivalence, where post-1979 rulers have a fraught view, fearing the secular nationalism he inspires, suppressing public gatherings on Cyrus Day, while occasionally trying to harness his image, showing the struggle between pre-Islamic memory and revolutionary ideology. Despite the different ideologies, this shows a curious convergence. Each season Cyrus a reflection of its identity aspirations. Micro recap 2. Let's pause for a quick recap on Cyrus. In Israel, he's a revered biblical figure symbolizing divine support for the Jewish people, an archetype for modern allies like Truman and Trump. In Iran, he's a complex national hero representing pre-Islamic glory, admired by the people but viewed with suspicion by the clerical regime as a potential rival to revolutionary identity. Both use his legacy to frame their national narratives, often through the lens of divine favor or betrayal.
Beyond Cyrus, the sources discuss how theological language is increasingly used in modern conflict rhetoric. What does that look like in practice, starting with Israel?
Yes, both Israel and Iran are increasingly infusing their political and military rhetoric with overtly religious and prophetic language, particularly since around 2020, maybe even earlier. Leaders, clerics, and state-aligned media draw on scripture and eschatology to frame geopolitical struggles as part of a larger divine saga. In Israel, biblical references and prophetic allusions are prominent in speeches justifying military actions, especially against Hamas and Iran. A striking example is PM Netanyahu during the 2023 Israel-Hamas war. Rallying the nation after the October 7 attacks, he repeatedly invoked scripture to define the war's purpose.
Like the Amalek reference.
In late October 2023, he used that line from Deuteronomy. You must remember what Amalek has done to you. The Amalekites were an ancient enemy in the Bible cursed for a surprise attack, whom God commanded to be totally destroyed. By equating Hamas with Amalek, Netanyahu framed the war as a sacred struggle to blot out an embodiment of evil, implying Hamas must be utterly wiped out like Amalek. This move imbued the campaign with an almost biblical mandate, which definitely alarmed some critics who saw it as a call for merciless retaliation.
And there were other examples.
Yes, Netanyahu also used other verses to reinforce resolve. At a press conference, he quoted Ecclesiastes. There is a time for peace and a time for war. This is a time for war, explicitly rejecting ceasefire calls and casting the moment in cosmic terms, a divinely appointed time for war. He also appealed to prophetic hope, citing Isaiah 60.18. Violence shall no more be heard in your land, but you shall call your walls salvation. He suggested prosecuting the war now would ultimately fulfill Isaiah's vision of peace within Israel's borders, painting the war as paradoxically serving a messianic peace. And it's not just Netanyahu. Other officials like Ord Strock linked the war up north to miracles, facilitating Israel's expansion to the West Bank, echoing Joshua's conquest narratives and implying God's intervention. Religious nationalists often see current wars as literally fulfilling ancient promises like territorial expansion.
Right.
Fringe, but perhaps increasingly mainstream voices, label adversaries like Palestinians or Iran as Gog and Magog, viewing conflicts as stages of the end times. While the IDF command itself is secular, there's official tolerance and even promotion of religious motifs. The IDF chief rabbi cites scripture to boost morale. A notable case directly related to our topic, the 2025 conflict, was the code name for the secret Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear sites. Operation Rising Lion. This comes from Numbers 23.24. Behold, the people shall rise up as a great lion. Netanyahu even reportedly tucked a handwritten note with this verse into the western wall before the operation, almost like petitioning God. The full verse speaks of Israel rising like a lion to devour its prey, a strikingly militant biblical image invoked on the eve of battle. This blending of ritual and operational planning shows how biblical archetypes are deeply seeping into Israel's strategic narrative in the 2020s.
So this theological rhetoric serves both religious and strategic purposes.
Many Israelis genuinely see history through a biblical lens, especially religious Zionists, who see victories as prophecy fulfillment. Leaders use it to galvanize support and moral certainty, casting conflicts as existential and non-negotiable. The risk, of course, is seeing enemies as biblical evil, which could potentially license extreme measures.
And on the Iranian side, how is religious language used in conflict rhetoric? What are the key concepts there?
Iran's conflict language is steeped in Shia Islamic eschatology and symbolism, particularly Mahdism, the belief in the coming of the Mahdi, the hidden 12th Imam, who they believe will reappear at the end of time to usher in global justice. Leaders in state media frequently cast enmity with Israel and the West as an apocalyptic showdown tied to Islamic prophecy. Khamenei and the IRGC explicitly link conflicts to the end times. Khamenei calls Israel a cancerous tumor that will undoubtedly be uprooted and destroyed, using this absolutist language suggesting inevitable fate, which aligns with Shia hadiths predicting a confrontation with Jews before the Mahdi's advent.
So defeating Israel becomes a religious necessity.
According to this view, yes, IRGC-linked clerics openly teach that the existence of Israel is the greatest barrier to the reappearance of the 12th Imam. Removing Israel becomes both a political goal and a divine prerequisite. Hardline Ayatollahs cite prophecies that the Jewish state will be destroyed before Mahdi's arrival, and that Shia Muslims will fight a climactic war against Jews as part of the end times. State media constantly amplify these themes, portraying Israel's annihilation as predestined. Examples are everywhere. An IRGC ideologue, Mehdi Taib, told Basij militia they must remove the obstacle to the emergence of Imam Mahdi, the most important of which is the usurper Zionist regime, describing a coming final war. During the Syrian civil war, many Shiite jihadists fought partly because they believed a prophecy that Damascus would be the site of an epic battle heralding Mahdi's return. An Iranian MP linked the war to prophecy, saying the Islamic Revolution is a prelude to the Mahdi's appearance. The IRGC published guidance in 2022 instructing troops that waiting for the Mahdi means preparing for soldiering in the Imam's army, urging a war footing against global oppression.
So conflicts are framed as steps towards this ultimate event.
They're seen as part of a holy continuum battles between the Army of Justice, Iran and its allies in the axis of resistance, and the Army of Falsehood, the West, Zionism, in the lead up to the end of days. And the highest levels echo this. Khamenei's Mahdism doctrine from the 1990s argues the Islamic Republic must actively prepare the ground for the Mahdi. Iran's constitution calls for extending God's law throughout the world, which is seen as fulfilling an end times mission. IRGC commanders see their mandate this way. Commander Salami's 2022 vow to remove Israel from the face of existence is tied to the belief that Israel's elimination is necessary to hasten the Mahdi's era, and that Tehran countdown clock ticking down to 2040 based on Khamenei's prediction for Israel's end. That's a very stark public symbol of this belief.
It really is.
Quranic language of cosmic struggle is also heavily used. Khamenei describes the U.S. and Israel as forces of global arrogance and modern jahiliyyah, or ignorance. Branding Israel, the little Satan, casts enemies as literal embodiments of evil. During crises, state media hails attacks on Israel as divine retribution, quoting verses about the defeat of unbelievers. And the Shia martyrdom ethos also colors war language, linking fallen soldiers to Imam Hussein's martyrs at Karbala. So Iran's rhetoric is deeply infused with prophecy, making theological justification central. This legitimizes actions and motivates loyalists. It also aims to erode enemy morale by suggesting Iran will never relent because the struggle is sacred. Each side ends up seeing the other through its own scriptural lens. Israel sees Haman or Amalek or Gog. Iran sees the Dajjal, an impediment to the Mahdi which contributes massively to the intractability of the conflict. Micro Recap 3. In summary, both Israel and Iran heavily utilize religious and prophetic language in their conflict rhetoric. Israel draws on the Hebrew Bible, invoking figures like Amalek or prophecies from Isaiah and Deuteronomy to frame conflicts as sacred struggles or steps toward redemption, seen even in the codename Operation Rising Lion from Scripture. Iran employs Shia Mahdism, casting the conflict with Israel and the West as an apocalyptic battle against forces of evil that must be won to pave the way for the Mahdi's return.
Does this prophetic language just stay in rhetoric, or does it actually influence policy and strategy decisions on the ground?
The source explores this directly, stating that religious narratives and prophetic beliefs have, at times, influenced actual policy decisions in the 21st century, not only in Israel and Iran, but also in the United States and elsewhere. Leaders invoke divine destiny or prophecy in framing military and foreign policy, sometimes out of sincere conviction, other times more strategically. For Israel, which the source terms policy by promise, the state was founded with a strong undercurrent of biblical destiny. Even early secular leaders referenced the Bible for justification. As religious nationalism grew, explicit prophetic motivations surfaced more clearly in policy. Think about the movement to expand settlements in the West Bank. It's often driven by a deeply held belief in the biblical promise of the land. Politicians argue retaining Judea and Samaria fulfills God's covenant and is therefore non-negotiable. The push for Jewish rights on the Temple Mount is fueled by groups speaking of preparing for the Third Temple, influencing lawmakers despite the obvious foreign relations impacts.
Right, the Temple Mount is a huge flashpoint.
And you see the rhetoric blend with policy, like when Netanyahu in 2019 lauded the U.S. recognition of Golan sovereignty as a pure miracle, linking it to the biblical story of Esther. He explicitly cast Trump's decision as akin to an Esther-like salvation. This served domestic political purposes and flattered U.S. evangelical allies who see such moves as prophecy steps. In 2020, when considering West Bank annexation, some ministers cited God's promise in Genesis that the land is an everlasting possession to argue against compromise. Here, belief and political expediency seem to intertwine quite clearly.
And in Iran, how does ideology translate to action?
In Iran, termed ideology to action, policy is openly underpinned by religious doctrine, the concept of velayat faqih, ruled by the jurisprudent, making it hard to disentangle sincere belief from statecraft. The no recognition of Israel policy isn't just political. It's couched in the theological view that Israel's existence is an offense to Islam that must eventually be rectified by providence. So, support for proxies is justified not just strategically, but as part of an ideological mission to champion the oppressed, reflecting Quranic injunctions.
Do leaders seem to genuinely believe this?
Many in Iran's leadership appear sincere. Former President Ahmadinejad, for example, was reportedly deeply influenced by Mahdism, believing the Mahdi's return was near. His government invested in infrastructure linked to Mahdi veneration, like the Jamkaran Mosque, and he spoke of Israel's elimination in prophetic terms, suggesting a sincere belief that policy should actively pave the way for the Mahdi. At the same time, the ruling establishment sometimes uses modest rhetoric strategically to bolster legitimacy and motivate sacrifice. Think of invoking the martyrdom of Karbala during the Iran-Iraq War, or using Mahdism in IRGC indoctrination to inspire fighters in Syria. Convincing fighters they are in a final battle ensures zealous commitment. But the clerics promoting this likely believe it themselves, making it simultaneously genuine and strategically useful.
What about the nuclear program?
Iran's nuclear policy might also have an undercurrent of prophetic mission, framed as challenging global arrogance. Western observers worry that a regime viewing an apocalyptic confrontation as inevitable might take incredibly risky actions. However, Iran's leadership has also shown strategic restraint at times, indicating that while they may believe in an eventual divine showdown, they are often content for it to play out gradually. The religious narrative sets the long-term, uncompromising direction, while realpolitik often governs short-term tactics.
And the source mentions the U.S. too.
Yes, in the United States, prophecy and foreign policy, a secular nation, leaders' worldviews have still been influenced, particularly regarding Israel and the Middle East. President George W. Bush, an evangelical, reportedly told French President Chirac that the Iraq invasion was a struggle against Gog and Magog from the Bible, and that biblical prophecies are being fulfilled, urging Chirac to join what he framed as a divinely ordained mission. This astonishing anecdote, confirmed by sources, suggests Bush overlaid a prophetic narrative, though he didn't typically use that language publicly.
Wow, that's quite something.
It is. Another example involves the Trump administration. Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State and an evangelical, openly entertained the idea that Trump was raised by God for such a time as this, echoing the Book of Esther. In a 2019 interview, he said, "As a Christian, I certainly believe that's possible," referring to pro-Israel policies like the Golan recognition, which Netanyahu had called a Purim miracle. This explicit coordination of biblical narrative with policy played well with Trump's evangelical base. VP Mike Pence frequently cited biblical promises about Israel to reassure audiences that supporting Israel was a biblically mandated course. So under Trump, prophetic language was both sincerely embraced by some policymakers and strategically amplified. Elsewhere, groups like ISIS explicitly referenced end-times prophecies for battle sites like Dabq, clearly a sincere driver and recruitment tool. State leaders like Putin sometimes invoke spiritual destiny more subtly.
So sincerity versus strategy. It's complicated.
It's a spectrum, really. Some leaders genuinely believe the narratives they invoke. For them, prophecy is a motivator and guide. Others use the language instrumentally, as a calculated tool to inspire citizens or allies, casting their agenda in absolute unnegotiable terms. Often, it's probably a mix of both. In Iran, the blurring is particularly strong. Strategic interests often align neatly with ideological ones. Using prophetic language is both natural and tactical. The sincerity lends credibility to the strategy. Followers fight harder for what they see as a higher cause.
Well, what are the consequences of...
The infusion of prophecy into policy discourse has significant implications. Domestically, it can bolster unity and resolve. Internationally, it often raises alarm. Adversaries hearing cosmic, zero-sum terms can undermine diplomacy. Analysts warn that framing conflict as a holy war risks creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of unending confrontation. Former Israeli Foreign Minister Shlomo Ben-Ami argues that hardliners of both countries feed off each other's messianic rhetoric, using it to justify their own maximalist policies. This dynamic sidelines, moderates, and turns complex policy debates into battles of faith versus reason. Prophetic language is a double-edged sword. For some, it's a sincere compass shaping decisions. For others, a conscious rhetorical tool. Often it's a mix. These narratives powerfully shape national consciousness. In Israel and Iran, historical memory and scripture provide a lens to interpret struggles, each seeing itself in a divinely scripted drama. As leaders invoke the prophetic mirror, their policies reflect a sense of higher mission. This gives resolve, but risks turning worldly conflicts into holy wars. Understanding this interplay of faith and strategy, let's recap Section 2 on memory, mythology, and identity. Cyrus the Great holds contrasting but symbolically important legacies. Israel views him as a Gentile messiah, an archetype for righteous Gentile support, Truman, Trump. Iran views him as a pre-Islamic founder and symbol of national pride, admired by the populace, but viewed with ambivalence by the clerical regime. Both narratives use Cyrus to frame national destiny, often through lenses of divine favor or betrayal. Biblical and Shia prophetic language is increasingly used in Israeli and Iranian conflict rhetoric. Israeli leaders use biblical figures, Amalek, and prophecies, Isaiah, to define war aims and galvanize support, e.g. Operation Rising Lion. Iranian leaders utilize Shia Mahdism, casting conflict with Israel West as an apocalyptic showdown to pave the way for the Mahdi, predicting Israel's elimination, for example, 2040 clock. This theological language influences policy, driven by sincere belief, Iran's ideology, U.S. evangelicals, or used strategically, Netanyahu galvanizing support, IRGC motivate. The infusion of prophecy into policy bolsters domestic unity, but raises international alarm, undermining diplomacy and risking holy war frame. Here are the key points from this section for retention. Cyrus, biblical liberator, Israel versus imperial founder, Iran. Cyrus, divine favor, Israel versus regime ambivalence, betrayal. Rhetoric, biblical prophecy, Israel versus Shia Mahdism, Iran.
Yeah.
Israeli examples, Amalek, Isaiah 60.18, Operation Rising Lion, Numbers 23.24. Iranian examples, Mahdi's return, Israel as barrier, 2040 prediction, influence, sincere belief plus strategic tool, policy impact. Consequence, undermines diplomacy, risks holy war frame. Type continue for further detail.
Shifting gears now, our next source looks at the concrete strategic and geopolitical consequences of Operation Rising Lion across the Middle East. How did this conflict actually reshape military doctrines and alliances for the key players involved?
Right. This section offers a full assessment of the profound shifts in military doctrine, diplomatic posture, a reliance on proxy forces, and strategic pivots for both Iran and Israel. And it also looks at the significant recalibration of alliances among broader Middle Eastern states like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Turkey, and Iraq in the wake of the conflict.
Okay, let's start with the event itself. What was Operation Rising Lion, according to the sources, and what was its stated goal?
So in June 2025, Israel launched a sweeping and coordinated series of strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities and also its military infrastructure. The stated goal was twofold. First, to eliminate Iran's potential nuclear weapons capability, and second, to undermine the regime's power and its capacity to threaten Israel. The operation was notably codenamed Operation Rising Lion, as we discussed.
It was extensive.
Very extensive. The Israeli campaign targeted Iran's major known uranium enrichment sites, like Natanz and Isfahan, which are for producing fissile material. It also struck missile production centers and air defenses. Additionally, the strikes killed numerous senior figures in Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and its nuclear program, aiming to decapitate leadership and expertise.
And Iran's response to these unprecedented strikes on its soil.
Well, Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei immediately condemned the attacks and vowed historic revenge. Iran retaliated by firing hundreds of ballistic missiles and armed drones at Israeli cities over a period of about 2 days. The United States, while reportedly not involved in initiating the strike, provided defensive support by helping intercept Iranian missiles, signaling its commitment to Israel's defense.
Right.
After the exchanges subsided, Israel declared the operation a success, claiming it had set back Iran's nuclear timeline by years and decapitated key military leadership. This conflict significantly shifted the strategic landscape, moving things from a shadow war into open, direct confrontation.
The sources mention a map of Iran's nuclear facilities targeted. Can you describe what that map visually represents based on the text?
Yes, the source references a map showing Iran's main known nuclear facilities, places like Fordo, Kandab, Natanz, Isfahan, and Bushehr. Verbally describing this map, it would visually pinpoint these locations spread across Iran. The text indicates these specific locations were targeted in Israel's 2025 strikes. So the map essentially highlights the geographical scope of the Israeli operation against these sites.
How has Iran's military doctrine and strategic approach changed after these, devastating strikes?
Iran's leadership has been forced into a fundamental rethink of its defense doctrine. The Israeli onslaught gutted much of Iran's nuclear infrastructure and eliminated top IRGC commanders, exposing severe shortcomings in Iran's conventional deterrence and particularly its air defense. With air defenses described as heavily damaged and Israeli warplanes reportedly operating with impunity, Tehran recognized it simply cannot conventionally match Israel and the United States in open warfare.
So what's the shift?
As a result, Iran appears to be doubling down on asymmetric and unconventional strategies, leveraging proxies, developing missiles and drones. But crucially, Iran is urgently seeking a more credible deterrent. Notably, the sources state Tehran has signaled a possible doctrinal shift toward open pursuit of nuclear weapons, the very outcome Israel sought to prevent.
That's a huge potential consequence.
Saudi observers quoted predict Iran will emerge fully committed to developing nuclear weapons, believing only an actual arsenal can guarantee regime survival against such threats. Influential voices in Tehran are reportedly pressuring Khamenei to revisit Iran's nuclear doctrine and restart weaponization as a last resort. This potential shift from hedging to actively seeking the bomb is likened by some to Iran drinking the poison chalice, referencing Khomeini's drastic decision to end the Iran-Iraq war. In the near term, however, Iran's response is constrained by the need for regime survival, and avoiding a wider war it probably can't win. Thus, the immediate strategy seems to be to avoid a wider conflict while still exacting a price via asymmetric means. This involves prioritizing rebuilding missile and drone forces, urgently improving air defense systems and early warning, and leveraging proxy forces for indirect retaliation.
You mentioned proxies again. How has the conflict impacted Iran's use of its proxy network, the so-called axis of resistance?
The war took a heavy toll on the IRGC's leadership and its primary proxies, leading to significant adjustments. Israel's decapitation strikes killed the IRGC commander-in-chief, Major General Hossein Salami, and other top commanders. This unprecedented loss has Tehran scrambling to fill positions and maintain command and control over its network.
A major blow.
Huge. In the immediate term, the IRGC is reportedly refocusing somewhat on internal security and homeland defense, fortifying infrastructure and dispersing assets, partly due to shaken public morale over the failure to prevent Israeli incursions. Iran's ballistic missile force was also partially crippled by covert operations. Sources mention a secret Israeli drone base reportedly operating inside Iran, used to destroy missile launchers at the war's outset. Nevertheless, Iran did launch multiple waves of missiles. Learning that large salvos were more effective than drones alone, the IRGC will likely invest further in its missile arsenal. Even before the war, Iran had secretly ordered vast quantities of missile-grade material from China, enough sources say for up to 800 ballistic missiles. Much of this is now likely earmarked to repair Iran's missile production plants and rearm groups like Yemen's Houthis, who have become an increasingly important long-range proxy.
So the proxy network is being reconfigured.
It remains central, but it's being recalibrated due to setbacks. Iran's strongest proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas, were severely degraded in the preceding 20 months or so of warfare. Hezbollah is now weakened and described as likely to express restraint, having suffered heavy losses, including reportedly its leader. Hamas was similarly crushed in Gaza after the 2023-25 war. This limited Iran's ability to retaliate directly via these traditional front lines.
So where are they pivoting?
Iran is pivoting to less impacted arenas, specifically Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. In Iraq and Syria, militias can target U.S. forces, which are seen as soft targets for indirect retaliation. The risk to U.S. troops is described as acute. Iranian officials signaled U.S. interests will be in Iran's crosshairs. The IRGC Quds force is likely coordinating harassment, probably hoping to avoid a direct U.S. intervention. In Yemen, the Houthis have taken a more prominent role since 2024, launching drones and missiles toward Israel. Their ceasefire with the U.S. frayed, and they threaten retaliation against both Israel and the U.S. Iran is likely encouraging Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping or Israel itself, both for revenge and to elevate the Houthi status within the axis.
But they have to be careful not to overplay their hand.
Precisely. Iran must calibrate these actions carefully to avoid overly broadening the war. For instance, Tehran has refrained from ordering Hezbollah into a full-scale fight, recognizing it would be ruinous for Lebanon and Hezbollah itself. So in summary, Iran's post-2025 pivot means a significantly diminished direct conventional military posture, but a redoubled reliance on missiles and regional militias operating more from Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Micro Recap 4. To quickly recap Iran's pivot, Operation Rising Lion exposed severe conventional weaknesses, pushing Iran towards asymmetric warfare. A major potential shift is the open pursuit of nuclear weapons as a deterrent. While avoiding immediate wider conflict, Iran is rebuilding missile forces and recalibrating proxy use, focusing more on Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, as traditional strongholds like Hezbollah and Hamas were degraded in prior conflicts. They're also leveraging international partners.
That brings us to Iran's international connections. How has diplomatic isolation and these battlefield losses impacted its alliances, particularly with Russia and China?
Diplomatic isolation by the West and the battlefield losses have definitely driven Iran to strengthen partnerships with non-Western powers, primarily Russia and China. During the conflict, Tehran received vocal diplomatic backing but little concrete military assistance from Moscow and Beijing. Moscow condemned the strikes but avoided committing to directly aiding Iran militarily, urging restraint from all sides.
Even with their strategic partnership.
Yes. Western analysts note Russia wasn't formally obligated to defend Iran, even under their January 2025 Strategic Partnership Agreement. And besides, Russia's military is heavily tied up in Ukraine. Going forward, Iran will still seek advanced weapons like Su-35 fighter jets and S-400 air defense systems from Russia, but probably with tempered expectations about delivery speed and scale. These deals are likely being expedited now to plug Iran's exposed air defense gaps. Iran's air defenses, deeply embarrassed by their failure, are working to revive Iran's air defense system and replace destroyed SAM sites, necessitating imports. Russia's priority, however, will likely remain securing Iranian drones for its own use in Ukraine, rather than radically upgrading Iran's overall capabilities. Russia has shown some interest in mediating future nuclear talks, but Iran's trust is likely limited given Moscow's recent failure to assist a strategic partner militarily.
And China's role?
China's role is primarily economic and diplomatic. Beijing condemned the strikes and called for a ceasefire, reiterating its preference for political solutions. China carefully balanced its position, supporting Iran's sovereignty rhetorically while being careful not to encourage retaliation that could destabilize the Gulf and threaten its energy imports. Behind closed doors, Chinese envoys likely urged restraint. China continues its quiet trade, becoming Iran's essential economic lifeline by purchasing over 1 million barrels of Iranian oil per day, often via sanctions evasion methods. China is expected to continue providing Tehran with economic and technological lifelines like dual-use materials that could be used for missiles, while carefully avoiding direct military entanglement.
So strategically, Iran is pushed further into their camp.
Yes, Iran's alignment with the Sino-Russian camp is definitely reinforced. Tehran joined the BRICS Plus group on January 1, 2024, cementing its pivot away from the US-led international order. In forums like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, Iran leverages its membership for diplomatic support. The SCO, for instance, condemned the Israeli strikes. Iran will likely deepen its involvement in initiatives like BRICS's de-dollarization drive to reduce reliance on the US dollar and lessen the impact of sanctions pressure. These partnerships are seen as a vital shield against Western isolation. So, in summary, post-2025, Iran is more tied to Moscow and Beijing, but it's also learned the limits of their support. It will seek arms from these partners, but also invest heavily in self-reliance. The regime narrative is one of rebuilding stronger, but quietly the calculus is survival, seeking guarantees to deter future strikes, possibly including that nuclear option.
Okay, let's turn to Israel. What did the sources say about Israel's post-war regional security position and its strategic gains from this operation?
Israel emerged with several significant, though certainly hard-won, strategic benefits, according to the sources. PM Netanyahu hailed the operation a major success that set back Iran's nuclear program by years, an assessment independent sources seem to agree with, at least in the short to medium term. Israel likely achieved its primary goal of delaying Iran's ability to produce a weapon. The airstrikes caused significant damage to key nuclear sites at Natanz and Isfahan, destroying facilities and, significantly, killing 9 senior scientists described as the brain trust of the program. While the deeply buried tunnels at Fordo reportedly survived the first wave of strikes, Israel's campaign of repeated strikes signals its intent to target even those hardened sites if necessary.
And the impact on Iran's military leadership.
The decapitation of Iran's military leadership has apparently thrown Iran's system into chaos, eliminating decades of experience at the very top. Confirmed killed included the Armed Forces Chief of Staff, the overall IRGC commander, the IRGC Airspace Force Chief, and even a former defense minister involved in the nuclear program. Their removal delivered a major psychological and operational shock, and may have diminished Iran's credibility both domestically and regionally. Regionally, Israel demonstrated unprecedented reach, penetration, and precision, showcasing advanced capabilities. There's mention of rumored AI-enabled target selection and autonomous drones, marking a potential technological and strategic turning point. They managed to suppress Iran's initial missile response capacity by striking launch sites early, limiting the volleys on Israeli cities. This reinforced Israel's deterrence posture. Both friends and foes saw that Israel can, and importantly will, act decisively to neutralize perceived existential threats. As one analysis put it, Israel demonstrated its full penetration of Iran. Iran has never looked weaker.
And the impact on proxies.
Yes. Another key benefit cited is the significant attrition of Iran-backed threats right on Israel's borders. By 2025, Iran's long-term strategy of surrounding Israel with powerful proxies was significantly thwarted. Parallel conflicts had already decimated Tehran's strongest regional proxies, Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon. The long 14-month war with Hezbollah in 2024 left it a shadow of its former self, reportedly costing its leader's life. Hamas was similarly crushed in Gaza after the 2023-25 war. This meant Iran's ability to retaliate via these crucial fronts was severely limited, enhancing Israel's security in the north and south, at least temporarily.
Any diplomatic gains?
Potentially. Israel's bold action, enforcing its long-standing begin doctrine preventing hostile states from acquiring nuclear arms, signaled it remains the preeminent regional force willing and able to confront Iran directly. Some Gulf Arab leaders, while condemning the strikes publicly, privately acknowledged the strike removed a threat they couldn't address themselves. This could translate into deeper, albeit covert, security cooperation with states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who share Israel's goal of curbing Iranian power. Israeli officials reportedly noted a paradigm shift, seeing the nuclear setback as potentially opening the door to new alignments, possibly even reviving prospects of formal Arab-Israeli security pacts down the line.
Despite these apparent gains, the source also points to emerging vulnerabilities for Israel after this.
Yes, it's definitely not all positive from Israel's perspective. First, the risk to Israel's home front wasn't negligible, despite defense successes. Iran's retaliatory missile barrage, though largely intercepted by Israeli and U.S. systems, showed that defenses aren't foolproof. Over 2 days, Iran launched roughly 200 ballistic missiles. Some did get through, tragically killing several civilians and wounding dozens, including a direct hit reported in Rishon. Images of families huddled in shelters underscored the population's vulnerability to mass missile attacks. While leaders clearly accepted this risk as necessary for the mission, it remains an Achilles heel Iran could exploit in the future, potentially eroding public confidence over time. Israel knows it must improve defenses and its ability to strike launch sites even faster.
What about diplomatic standing?
Second, Israel's unilateral action strained its diplomatic standing, particularly with the U.S., and risked further isolation. The U.S. under Trump, while tacitly approving the goal, was reportedly uneasy with the execution. Netanyahu apparently acted in defiance of Trump's call for caution, going alone without full coordination. This led to palpable tension with Washington, which worried Israel's actions dragged America closer to a wider war, requiring high alert status and the expenditure of costly interceptors. Though Trump lauded the initial strike's success, he also warned Iran of worse consequences if it escalated further, showing a reluctance for direct U.S. involvement in retaliation. The episode may leave some mistrust. Israel felt the strike was necessary. The U.S. felt minimal consultation risked chaos. This could complicate future cooperation and defense aid discussions, requiring Israel to mend fences.
And regionally.
Regionally, the actions elicited formal condemnations across the board and could stir latent hostility. Every major Middle Eastern government, even those quietly aligned with Israel against Iran, publicly condemned the strikes. This was partly to placate domestic public opinion and avoid inflaming regional tensions, underscoring Israel's continued isolation in the Muslim world. Even states fearing Iran felt compelled to denounce the use of force. Turkey's President Erdogan lambasted the attack as a violation of a Muslim nation's sovereignty, potentially increasing Turkish support for Palestinians or leading to new anti-Israel diplomatic proposals.
Did it impact normalization talks?
Yes, significantly. The strike killed the momentum for Saudi-Israel normalization talks, which were reportedly halted immediately. Riyadh publicly sought to lessen tensions with Iran, reaffirming its focus on de-escalation diplomacy. An open, formal Saudi-Israeli alliance is likely postponed indefinitely. So Israel's shift to open assertiveness carries risks. Proving it can strike, Iran also raises the stakes. If Iran rebuilds its capabilities, it may retaliate more fiercely next time, or seek to deter Israel via cyber attacks or hitting Israeli targets globally. Israeli officials acknowledge that the road to Iran has been paved for the Air Force, but it's a two-way street. It requires ongoing vigilance, potentially more mowing the grass operations if Iran rebuilds. This operational burden and the potential for a protracted shadow war are new vulnerabilities.
How has this impacted Israel's actual deterrence posture and military doctrine?
The conflict led to some clear adaptations. Israel seems to have expanded its interpretation of the Begin Doctrine beyond just destroying nuclear facilities to include concurrent strikes on adversary leadership and delivery systems, missiles, drones. Unlike prior isolated strikes on specific targets, 2025 was described as a multifaceted strike hitting dozens of targets simultaneously: nuclear sites, missile bases, command centers, and key leaders. This looks like a more comprehensive suppression doctrine aiming to cripple both the capability and the will to retaliate, integrating regime decapitation directly into deterrence strategy.
That sounds like a significant evolution.
It is. It represents deterrence by proactively neutering strike capacity and command structure right in the opening phase of a conflict. It requires extremely precise intelligence and the kind of long-range strike prowess Israel demonstrated, and it sets a precedent for how Israel might handle future perceived existential threats. Deterrence now also has a more explicit regional dimension. Striking Iran so openly sent a powerful message to other hostile regimes, perhaps like Syria, that Israel is willing to use decisive force even without explicit U.S. permission. This wasn't lost on regional powers like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, who now see Israel potentially emerging as the Middle East's unchallenged hegemon. Being seen as predominant bolsters deterrence, but it also requires Israel to reassure moderate Arab states that stability is the goal, not domination over them. Any operational lessons learned? Operationally, the IDF is clearly adapting lessons. The successful use of covert basing and unmanned systems is one key takeaway. That report of a secret drone launch base inside Iran striking missile launchers was significant, blinding Iran's immediate response capability. The IDF will likely seek to further develop such forward-deployed capabilities, maybe clandestine bases, cyber tools, even leveraging local insurgents for preemption and disruption. Swarming strikes using loitering munitions and precision missiles also proved effective. The reported heavy use of AI for target selection and battle management could become more formally integrated into doctrine.
And defensively.
Defensively, Israel is pushing to expand civil defense measures and strategic depth. The experience of absorbing missile volleys, even with high interception rates, accelerates the deployment of newer systems, like the Iron Beam laser interceptors. It also likely strengthens the case for regional missile defense cooperation. During the war, the U.S. reportedly pressed Arab Gulf states to activate their radar and air defense systems to track Iranian missiles heading towards Israel. This quasi-integration hints at a possible future interlocked early warning grid stretching from the Mediterranean to the Gulf, something Israel desires, and perhaps now more plausible as Arab states saw Iranian missiles flying over or near their territory. So Israel's deterrence posture will increasingly feature these quiet, practical regional defense partnerships. Micro Recap 5. To recap Israel's position, strategic gains included setting back Iran's nuclear program, decapitating military leadership, degrading key proxies, and demonstrating advanced capabilities, reinforcing deterrence. However, vulnerabilities include persistent home front risk from missile attacks, strained diplomatic ties with the U.S. due to unilateral action, public condemnation across the region, halting Saudi normalization, and the operational burden of potentially ongoing strikes if Iran rebuilds. Doctrine evolved to include leadership delivery system strikes, expanded begin doctrine, and incorporates regional defense cooperation and innovative tactics like covert forward basing and AI.
How did these events cause broader shifts in Middle Eastern alliances? What was the ripple effect across the region?
The war sent shockwaves, prompting significant realignments and recalculations across the board. Key states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Turkey, Iraq, all responded based on their own self-interest and the stark new reality of open Israel-Iran conflict. Broadly speaking, it seems to have accelerated a kind of bipolar tilt. States are being pulled, however reluctantly, toward either an anti-Iran alignment, often quietly cooperating with Israel and the U.S., or toward accommodating Iran. Many, though, are trying to hedge their bets.
Let's take Saudi Arabia first. How did they react?
Saudi Arabia found the war deeply unwelcome. They need regional calm for their ambitious Vision 2030 economic diversification plan. Riyadh publicly condemned Israel's strikes and called for de-escalation, which aligned with their recent thawing of ties with Tehran. Privately, however, Saudi officials were likely alarmed at Iran's capability and willingness to retaliate, especially the potential threat to their own oil facilities, remembering the devastating 2019 Abqaiq attack attributed to Iran or its proxies. Riyadh reportedly raised its air defense alert, deployed Patriot missile batteries, and sought security assurances from the U.S.
So strategically, where does that leave them?
Saudi Arabia is at a crossroads. If Iran does decide to openly pursue nuclear weapons, Riyadh might feel compelled to acquire its own nuclear capability, perhaps from Pakistan, or by developing it domestically, knowing the U.S. would strongly oppose this. The war definitely halted the Saudi-Iran rapprochement process and put the brakes on the U.S.-brokered Saudi-Israel normalization talks. Crown Prince MBS simply can't be seen cozying up to Israel publicly while needing to condemn its actions against Iran. Still, Saudi strategic interests align more closely with the U.S.-Israel camp in containing Iran. They'll likely continue quiet security cooperation with the U.S. and perhaps indirectly with Israel, like intelligence sharing, while maintaining a public balancing act. Permitting U.S. forces to operate from the kingdom during the conflict was a form of implicit siding. Going forward, Saudi might seek more formal U.S. security guarantees or even a nuclear umbrella in exchange for potential future normalization with Israel.
What about the UAE, also balancing?
Yes, the UAE performed a similar balancing act, mixing public condemnation with quiet relief over Iran's nuclear setback. As a member of the Abraham Accords, it has open ties with Israel but also maintains a pragmatic dialogue with Iran due to its geographical proximity and economic vulnerability. The UAE joined calls for restraint and offered humanitarian aid, but also activated its air defenses and worked closely with the U.S. Navy to keep the Strait of Hormuz open for shipping. Its oil pipeline bypassing the strait became an important point of energy diplomacy during the crisis. There were unconfirmed reports suggesting UAE radar data might have been shared, helping Israeli interceptors. The aftermath likely accelerates the quiet integration of air defenses involving Israel, Bahrain, potentially Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, facilitated by the U.S. Diplomatically, the UAE remains a potential mediator, but strategically tilts anti-Iran given its vulnerability.
In Egypt.
Egypt formally condemned Israel, called for an Arab League meeting, playing its traditional role as a major Arab leader. But behind the rhetoric, Cairo wasn't displeased to see Iran's regional influence curtailed, as this aligns with its own interests, like weakening Hamas, an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, Egypt's rival, and generally curbing Iranian expansionism. Egypt quietly supported U.S. diplomatic pressure on Iran and likely shared intelligence through existing channels. It remains cautious due to its peace treaty obligations with Israel and often hostile public opinion towards Israel, so it positioned itself mainly as a mediator, offering its good offices. Egypt remains firmly in the pro-U.S. camp and cooperates closely with Israel on border security. The war might push Egypt to participate more actively in regional forums focused on addressing Iranian threats.
Turkey took a sharper tone, didn't it?
Yes, Turkey sharply criticized Israel and, somewhat opportunistically, positioned itself as supporting Iran. President Erdogan condemned Israel's unilateral aggression and called for global action against it, aligning with his long-standing stance as a defender of Muslim nations. Turkey's foreign minister helped coordinate an Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC meeting, condemning Israel. Erdogan dialed up rhetoric about Muslim unity against tyranny, implicitly siding with Iran against Israel and the U.S. However, Turkey and Iran are also regional competitors with conflicting interests in places like Syria and Iraq. Turkey likely saw some advantage in backing Iran rhetorically to bolster its own leadership claims in the Muslim world and perhaps counterbalance Saudi UAE influence. Ankara will probably try to improve ties with Tehran pragmatically while reassuring NATO allies and even Israel that it remains a key player. Turkey avoided military engagement but didn't obstruct U.S. operations from its bases. It remains a wild card, using forums like the OIC and BRICS to carve out an independent stance.
And Iraq, caught in the middle.
Very uncomfortably caught in the middle. The official Iraqi government condemned Israel's strikes, but perhaps more consequential were the actions of the powerful Iran-backed militias operating within Iraq. They immediately branded the attack a Zionist American war on Islam and retaliated with rocket attacks near the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad and U.S. bases, just hours after the initial Israeli strike, fulfilling Iran's threat to hit U.S. targets indirectly. Non-essential U.S. personnel were evacuated. The Iraqi prime minister walked a tightrope, condemning violence while being politically beholden to these militias. The Iraqi parliament debated expelling U.S. forces again, signaling a potential further shift towards Iran's sphere of influence. If the U.S. were forced out completely, Iraq would likely tilt squarely towards Iran. The war might increase Iran's political sway in Iraq short-term, but Iran's weakened state could potentially boost Iraqi nationalist sentiment seeking more independence long-term. For now, Iraq aligns with Iran diplomatically and allows the militias significant leeway.
So what new alliances or groupings emerged?
Several nascent alliances or alignments became more pronounced. A de facto Israeli-Arab security understanding seems to be emerging, driven by the shared threat from Iran. It's not a formal alliance, but is pushing Israel and key Sunni Arab states into closer, albeit often quiet, alignment. Shared drills, military exercises, perhaps naval coordination in the Red Sea are likely to increase. The Negev Forum, bringing Israel together with several Arab states, might expand its focus to include joint defenses against Iran. Intelligence and counterterrorism alliances also likely deepened, spurred by the conflict, leading to greater intelligence cooperation among Israel, the U.S., and Arab partners against Iranian activities. We might see a more institutionalized Middle East Air Defense Alliance, perhaps coordinated by U.S. Central Command, allowing for real-time information sharing against missile and drone attacks. This is a notable potential realignment where, for example, Saudi radar might cue Israeli or U.S. interceptors, and Israeli cyber expertise might help Gulf states defend against Iranian attacks. So the conclusion is that the aftermath catalyzed a significant recalibration. Iran increasingly looks east towards Russia, China, and the global south via BRICS, while Israel draws closer, often behind the scenes, to key Arab states due to the common menace of Iran. The U.S. remains a key player, trying to rally allies and provide security, but its credibility and influence are constantly being tested. The landscape is clearly in flux, and alliances are shifting based on pragmatic interests. Saudi Arabia and the UAE tilt towards the Israel-U.S. camp but hedge their bets. Qatar and Oman try to mediate. Turkey and Iraq remain complex wildcards. The old fault lines, Arab, Israeli, Sunni, Shia, seem less salient than the new primary divide. Pro- or anti-Iran influence, with energy security and great power politics interwoven throughout. The trajectory really depends on whether these shifts lead to a new, fragile stability or simply set the stage for an even more perilous bullet points for Section 3. Let's recap Section 3 on strategic recalibration and regional realignments. Operation Rising Lion, June 2025 Israeli strikes on Iran, profoundly shifted military doctrine to diplomatic alignment. Iran's military doctrine is pivoting to asymmetric warfare, missile drone forces, proxy reliance, and potentially open pursuit of nuclear weapons after conventional weaknesses were exposed and leadership decapitated. Iran's proxy network is recalibrating, focusing on less degraded arenas like Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, while key proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas were significantly weakened. Iran is strengthening partnerships with Russia, seeking weapons but with limited expectations, and China, economic lifeline, dual-use materials, diplomatic support, leveraging BRICS plus membership. Israel achieves strategic gains by setting back Iran's nuclear program, decapitating leadership, degrading proxies, and demonstrating advanced capabilities, reinforcing deterrence and opening prospects for regional security cooperation. Israel also faces new vulnerabilities, continued home front risk from missiles, strained diplomatic ties with the U.S., regional condemnation, halting normalization, and the burden of managing an evolving Iranian threat. Israel's deterrence doctrine expanded, begin doctrine including decapitation, and incorporates innovative tactics, covert basing AI, and increased regional defense cooperation. Middle Eastern alliances are recalibrating. Saudi Arabia and the UAE balance public condemnation with quiet security cooperation with U.S.-Israel while hedging. Egypt maintains pro-U.S. Israel ties while mediating. Turkey criticizes Israel but seeks pragmatic ties. Iraq is caught between its government and pro-Iran militias targeting U.S. interests. The conflict accelerated a bipolar tilt, pro-anti-Iran, fostering nascent Israeli-Arab security understandings, intel sharing, air defense cooperation. Here are the key points from this section for retention. Rising Lion. Israeli strikes nuclear military leadership, Iran retaliation, missile drones. Iran pivot, asymmetric warfare, nuclear quest, recalibrating proxies, Iraq, Syria, Yemen focus, Iran alliances, closer ties, Russia, China, BRICS, plus limited military aid, economic, diplomatic, Israel gains, nuclear setback, decapitated leadership, proxies degraded, enhanced deterrence, Israel vulnerabilities, missile risk, U.S. diplomatic strain, shadow war burden, disbanded, begin doctrine, Encolada decapitation, AI covert tactics, regional defense coup, alliance shifts, bipolar tilt, pro-anti-Iran, Saudi UAE hedging quiet coup, Iraq caught, nascent Israeli-Arab security understanding, Negev Forum Air Defense Alliance. Type continue for further detail.
Our final section before the conclusion looks outward now, connecting the Israel-Iran conflict to broader global patterns and international norms. It highlights how these ancient grievances resonate in contemporary conflicts around the world, and importantly, how Operation Rising Lion impacts global frameworks designed to prevent proliferation and conflict.
This section provides a comprehensive analysis of how ancient grievances continue shaping contemporary geopolitical conflicts, using examples parallel to the Israel-Iran dynamics. And it offers a detailed exploration of how Operation Rising Lion has challenged international norms, particularly on nuclear proliferation and the use of force.
Let's start with those echoes of ancient grievances. The source draws parallels to other conflicts where history and trauma play a similar powerful role. Can you walk us through those examples?
Yes, the sources state that historical grievances weigh heavily on both sides' national identities and policies in the Israel-Iran dynamic. But this isn't unique. Similar patterns are seen in other conflicts around the world, showing how the weight of history can make modern disputes seem almost intractable. Armenia-Azerbaijan is presented as one parallel. The Armenian national psyche is deeply scarred by the collective memory of the Ottoman Turkish genocide of estimates say 1.5 million Armenians during World War I. This historical trauma translates into deep mistrust of Turkey and, by extension, Turkic Azerbaijan, which Armenians often perceive as a Turkish proxy. They fear a repetition of past atrocities. This collective memory has driven Armenia's insistence on protecting Nagorno-Karabakh's Armenian population and influenced Armenia's long-standing policy of aligning closely with Russia as a security guarantor.
And the view from Azerbaijan.
By contrast, Azerbaijan's narrative emphasizes the inviolability of internationally recognized borders and resentment over the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Azeris during the conflict in the 1990s. Baku frames Armenia's historical claims on Nagorno-Karabakh as an unlawful attempt to redraw borders based on ancient grudges. Azerbaijani national identity has been partly forged around reversing this perceived historical injustice and restoring territorial integrity, viewing the conflict through the lens of historical wrongs committed against their population. So you see how historical memory fuels conflicting claims and defines national identity on both sides.
A very clear parallel. What's another example?
Another one mentioned is India-Pakistan. Their intense rivalry is deeply rooted in historical and religious identity, born from the traumatic 1947 partition of British India. This event created new borders, but also left a bitter legacy of communal bloodshed and mass displacement. An estimated 12 million people were uprooted, and hundreds of thousands were killed. This traumatic birth laid the foundation for perpetual mutual distrust. At the heart of their dispute, of course, is Kashmir, whose contested accession to India in 1947 sparked the first of several wars and has since defined their antagonism. Kashmir symbolizes the unresolved grievances and enduring trauma of partition for both nations.
And China-Japan.
Yes. Japan is a third example. Japan's actions during World War II are a source of deep and lingering resentment in China. Memories of atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre, the use of comfort women, and the experiments of Unit 731 remain vivid, often reinforced by state media in China for domestic legitimacy and diplomatic leverage. Anti-Japanese sentiment can be easily mobilized over policy disputes. Textbook controversies in Japan, where historical narratives about the war are sometimes disputed or downplayed, frequently trigger diplomatic rows and reinforce China's view of Japan as unrepentant.
How does Japan grapple with this history?
Well, Japan's national identity seems pulled in two directions by this history. Post-1945, Japan adopted a pacifist constitution and cultivated an identity as a peace-loving nation, desiring reacceptance and feeling perhaps that it is sufficiently atoned. Yet there is also a persistent nationalist strain that feels Japan has apologized enough and questions the prevailing narratives of guilt, sometimes making revisionist remarks or engaging in provocative actions like visits to the controversial Yasukuni Shrine. These actions inevitably inflame tensions with China and South Korea, raising fears that Japan might be reviving militarism. Consequently, Japan's every defense policy shift is scrutinized through this historical lens. When Japan recently moved to expand its military capabilities, China immediately invoked history to criticize these steps. The weight of history thus acts as a constant constraint on Japan's military normalization. So these examples, Armenia, Azerbaijan, India, Pakistan, China, Japan, serve as contextual parallels to the Israel-Iran dynamics. They show how historical trauma, conflicting national narratives, and ancient grievances continue to shape modern geopolitical conflicts across the globe, often making them deeply intractable and resistant to purely rational solutions. It highlights a broader global pattern. Repeat this for retention. Ancient grudges plus modern conflicts often equal intractable dynamics.
Okay, moving to global frameworks and international norms. How did Operation Rising Lion impact the system designed to prevent nuclear proliferation, particularly the IAEA and the NPT, the Nonproliferation Treaty?
Operation Rising Lion significantly challenged international norms on nuclear proliferation, specifically impacting the authority and credibility of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, and the overall integrity of the NPT regime. The sources describe what they call the IAEA's crisis of credibility in the immediate aftermath. The agency scrambled, convening an emergency Board of Governors meeting. Inspectors on the ground in Iran assessed radiological safety at the struck nuclear sites, confirming no major radiation leaks at Natanz and Esheli, but they were deeply concerned about the status of nuclear material and Iran's future cooperation. The attack itself suddenly put the IAEA's ability to function and carry out its mandate in jeopardy, not primarily because of Iran's past non-compliance, but because the attack itself violated member states' sovereignty and targeted facilities under IAEA's safeguards.
What were the immediate fears?
There were immediate fears Iran would retaliate diplomatically by expelling IAEA inspectors or severely curtailing cooperation, maybe even withdrawing from the NPT altogether. The IAEA Director General, Rafael Grossi, warned the UN Security Council that a worst-case outcome would be an Iranian decision to end IAEA oversight, calling withdrawal from the NPT a red line. Such a move would strip the IAEA of its legal basis for access and monitoring in Iran and deal a severe blow to the agency's global credibility as the nuclear watchdog. Within days, Iran did reportedly restrict inspector access to some sites and was openly contemplating leaving the NPT, creating a perilous moment for the IAEA, which prides itself on being the neutral arbiter meant to prevent such crises.
And how did the strike challenge the NPT itself and broader international norms about proliferation?
Well, Israel's strike immediately raised uncomfortable questions about fairness and double standards within the international system, particularly concerning the NPT framework. Many non-nuclear weapon states, especially in the global south, have long complained that the NPT is enforced selectively much more strictly against non-nuclear states than against the recognized nuclear powers, or states outside the treaty like Israel. The fact that Israel, a state outside the NPT with its own undeclared nuclear arsenal, took it upon itself to militarily police the nuclear program of an NPT member state, Iran, strongly reinforced those complaints of hypocrisy and unequal application of international law.
And the U.S. backing didn't help perceptions.
No, perceptions weren't helped by the United States openly backing Israel's strategic objectives, with President Trump applauding the action. In the United Nations, several countries argued that this unilateral military action undermined the authority of the UN Security Council and the NPT framework, which are supposed to be the legitimate channels for handling proliferation concerns and violations. The argument essentially is, if powerful states or their allies can bypass these multilateral mechanisms at will, the incentive for other states to stick rigorously to NPT rules diminishes significantly. Hardliners in countries like Iran, or perhaps even elsewhere, might say, look what compliance brought Iran, sanctions, inspections, and eventually bombs falling. Maybe it's better not to rely on international agreements for security. This highlights the potential damage to the NPT's integrity and its goal of universal adherence.
What about the precedent it set for using force?
Yes. Finally, there's the precedent of unilateral force. One immediate normative effect was heightened fear among other regional actors who might be considering developing sensitive nuclear fuel cycle capabilities in the future. Saudi Arabia, Iran's arch foe, publicly condemned the strike, perhaps partly because it sets a precedent that any country's sensitive facilities, even a hypothetical future Saudi nuclear program, could be deemed fair game for preemptive attack, regardless of treaty commitments. The strike's scale and perceived military success might embolden other states with similar advanced capabilities to consider similar actions. On the other hand, the ferocity of Iran's retaliation, the missile and drone attacks on Israel, the strikes on U.S. assets in Iraq also served as a sobering reminder that such preempt military moves can easily spark wider, uncontrollable conflict. This might actually make states more cautious. So it cuts both ways. It potentially cuts both ways. In essence, Operation Rising Lion has become a key reference point, a case study in international debates over just ad bellum, the right to go to war, particularly in the nuclear age. It challenges the international community to clarify under what circumstances, if any, a unilateral military strike on another state's nuclear infrastructure can be justified or tolerated, especially outside of UN Security Council authorization or clear eminent self-defense. Without a clear consensus on this, the risk is a drift toward a more Hobbesian world, where nations feel freer to act first militarily based on their own threat perceptions, a world antithetical to the UN Charter's ideals of collective security. As of late 2025, according to the sources, the jury is still out on how this precedent will ultimately solidify. But it unquestionably spurred intense discussions in foreign ministries worldwide about the erosion, or perhaps selective reinforcement, depending on your perspective, of norms against preventive war and unilateral force. This connects directly back to the Israel-Iran dynamic, because their actions inevitably have ripple effects far beyond their borders, impacting global norms and the very frameworks designed to prevent proliferation and conflict. End of chapter. Let's recap section 4 on global frameworks and civilizational echoes. Ancient grievances and conflicting historical narratives deeply influence national identities and fuel contemporary geopolitical conflicts beyond Israel-Iran, seen in parallels like Armenia-Azerbaijan, genocide memory versus territorial integrity, India-Pakistan, partition trauma, Kashmir dispute, and China-Japan, WWII atrocities versus nationalist revisionism. Operation Rising Lion significantly challenged international norms on nuclear proliferation and the NPT regime. The strike put the IAEA's ability to function in jeopardy by potentially prompting Iran to restrict access and withdraw from the NPT, damaging the agency's credibility. Israel's unilateral action as a non-NPT state with its own arsenal reinforced complaints of selective NPT enforcement and undermined UN Security Council authority, potentially reducing incentives for NPT adherence. The strike set a dangerous precedent for unilateral force against sensitive facilities, raising fears among other states, although Iran's retaliation also served as a cautionary tale. Operation Rising Lion became a key case study in debates over the right to war, jus et bellum, in the nuclear age, risking a drift toward a more militarized international environment. Here are the key points from this section for retention. Civilizational echoes. Ancient grievances fuel conflicts. Armenia, Azerbaijan, India, Pakistan, China, Japan. IAEA. Attack jeopardized credibility, risked Iran leaving NPT. NPT. Unilateral strike by non-member. Israel undermined norms, selective enforcement perceived. Precedent. Unilateral force against nuclear facilities. Debate over jus et bellum. Risk. Drift toward Hobbesian world. Erosion of norms versus preventive war.
Incredibly complex layers of history, identity, and strategy at play in the aftermath of Operation Rising Lion.
It has indeed. We've extensively explored the long-term global and regional implications of the Israel-Iran conflict, drawing directly and, I hope, comprehensively from the sources you provided.
From the precarious survival of Iran's ancient Jewish community, caught between demonstrating national loyalty and facing regime suspicion, dealing with cultural erasure by attrition and that sort of ambient intimidation, to the deep historical narratives shaping identity and policy in both Israel and Iran, like the contrasting legacies of Cyrus the Great and the increasing use of religious prophecy in conflict rhetoric.
And the profound strategic recalibration across the Middle East, where Iran pivots towards asymmetric warfare and perhaps seeks nuclear guarantees as a deterrent after its conventional weaknesses were exposed, while Israel adjusts its deterrence doctrine to include leadership decapitation and cautiously pursues these nascent regional security cooperations with certain Arab states.
To the global echoes of ancient grievances and historical trauma seen in other conflicts, like Armenia, Azerbaijan, India, Pakistan, and China, Japan, illustrating how history makes disputes intractable, and the challenging precedent Operation Rising Lion set for international norms on nuclear proliferation, impacting the IAEA's credibility and raising questions about the selective enforcement of the NPT and the right to use unilateral force.
All these threads are deeply interwoven, aren't they? The conflict isn't just a singular geopolitical event. It's profoundly rooted in centuries of history, competing belief systems, national trauma, and hard-nosed strategic calculations. All of this influences decisions and alliances across the region and beyond in really complex ways.
We've seen the potential future geopolitical risks clearly laid out in the sources, from accelerated nuclear pursuits in Iran to significant shifts in regional power balances, and the potential for further escalation if these underlying historical tensions, strategic dynamics, and frankly powerful narratives aren't addressed or managed effectively.
Understanding the enduring role historical memory, civilizational narratives, and religious frameworks play in shaping modern geopolitics it shows that to find pathways for diplomatic resolutions, or at least to manage future risks, we need to look beyond the immediate events and grasp the deeper historical, ideological, and strategic forces at work that make these conflicts so challenging. The prophetic mirror, as our sources described it, continues to reflect and refract actions, making these conflicts particularly difficult to resolve through purely rational or diplomatic means alone.
This has been truly exhaustive, the complexities stemming from Operation Rising Lion and its aftermath in 2025 and beyond, drawing directly and extensively from the sources you provided. There's certainly a lot to process here, reflecting the multifaceted nature of this period.
Indeed. The sources paint a detailed, if unsettling, picture of a region and a world wrestling with ancient echoes in modern conflicts and the dangerous implications of challenging established international frameworks for peace and security.
Thank you for guiding us through these materials with such clarity and depth.
My pleasure. Understanding these nuances, these layers of history, and the strategic shifts is essential, I think, for anyone trying to make sense of the current geopolitical landscape.
And thank you, our listeners, for bringing us these fascinating and detailed sources and allowing us to together. We hope this analysis gives you a more informed perspective on the layers of fallout, memory, and new realities emerging from this critical period in the Middle East and the world. What stands out to you after hearing all this? How do you see historical narratives influencing conflicts you encounter or read about in your own experience? Something to consider as you process this.
The strike delayed Iran's program. It also damaged the scaffolding meant to prevent a race. What once felt regulated, nuclear norms, nonproliferation rules, the line between rhetoric and doctrine, now feels more exposed, more unstable. And beneath it all, Scripture, invoked as strategy, memory framed as mission, leaders seeing destiny where others see deterrence, a region that once prayed together, now bracing for the next rupture, not because it is desired by all people, but because it now feels inevitable.
Please like and subscribe.